So today we're going to be talking about chapter 6 and 8. Chapter 8 slides are basically just like kind of a little bit more detailed summary of chapter 6. So I'm probably not going to go into chapter 8 just because it's basically the exact same thing. But today we're talking about government policies. And so when we're talking about government policies, our agenda for today is basically looking at price controls and then taxes as well. And so for price controls, the main thing we're going to talk about is price ceilings and price floors, and kind of differentiating between the two. And then for taxes, we'll look at deadweight loss, tax revenue, social welfare, and elasticity in taxes. So what are price controls? So price controls are just basically any government policy that alters the private market outcome. And so in this example right here, I just have the minimum wage law for California. So the minimum wage is an example of a price control that the government sets. And so the government basically can choose at any time to regulate the price of a good, and it can regulate the price of a good through two different means. So it can do that one through just setting the price of the good. So it can basically say, the government of New York could say, we're going to require that the price of an orange is $1. And so then that's just the price of an orange in the state of New York is now $1. The other thing the government can do is the government can set a minimum or maximum price for the good. So basically the lowest price you can pay for the good or the highest price you can pay for the good. And so those two types of minimum and maximums, the price ceiling is the maximum on the price of a good or service. So basically the government's saying that this is the legal maximum price for that good or service. Whereas for the price floor, it's basically just the opposite. It's a legal minimum on the price of the good or service. So I'm going to walk through a couple examples of price ceilings. So in this first example, we have a rental market. So this is the rental market for apartments, where we have the price of an apartment on this and the quantity of the apartment down here. So in this market, the initial equilibrium price is going to be $800. The initial equilibrium quantity is going to be 300. So that is our initial equilibrium that we have right here. But a price ceiling is effectively putting some sort of cap or minimum on what the price of the good is. And you'll have two different types of price ceilings. So the first type is going to be non-binding. Did someone have a question? Okay. If you do, feel free to unmute yourself. So a price ceiling is effectively just, there's two different types, basically non-binding and binding. So the first one we're going to talk about here is non-binding. And so this is a price ceiling that is above the equilibrium price. So you can see right here that the price ceiling of $1,000 is above the normal equilibrium price of $800. And so when the price ceiling is above the equilibrium price, it has no effect on market outcome. And so what I just mean by that is basically the price in this market is still going to be $800. So if a price ceiling is non-binding, it has no impact on the equilibrium price in the market, which in this case is $800. And another important piece of that is a price ceiling is non-binding when it is above the equilibrium price. So we can see here any price ceiling that is above $800 is going to be non-binding. So the next example then is if a price ceiling is binding. And that just effectively means that it does change the market outcome. So it actually does change the equilibrium price in the market here. So we can see that in this case, let's say the government instituted a price ceiling in the rental market of $500 for an apartment. So this is the price ceiling that the government instituted. And this price ceiling is binding. And it's binding because it is below the equilibrium price right here. And so when a price ceiling is binding, there's a shortage in the market. And all I mean by a shortage is just that the quantity demanded here is greater than the quantity supplied. So in this case, what that's telling us is effectively there is a greater demand for apartments at a price of $500 than there is a supply of apartments. So there is a shortage of apartments for rental at a price of $500.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So a ceiling is always binding when it's below the equilibrium price, and
Yes,
it's always not binding when it's above.
exactly.
Professor,
Yeah.
so what are some examples besides like rent for price ceilings?
Yeah, so anything that the government wants to decrease the equilibrium price in the market. So we think of like minimum wages being a price floor, but a price ceiling could be something like a lot of governments have a price ceiling on gas. So basically, they say the uh, equilibrium price of gas is too high, so they subsidize gas prices. So they're effectively lower than they would normally be. That's a pretty common one, besides apartments.
And like medicine, that would count too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, medicine is a good one too. Not as common in the US, but very common in like other countries.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir, so on the price ceiling, if it's not binding, it'll be above the equilibriums, and that doesn't affect so it won't cause us a surplus.
Exactly. Yeah. So when it's above the equilibrium price, you can basically pretend that it's not even there.
Oh, so it does not create a surplus or anything. It just won't affect at all. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. And so like hypothetically on an exam, I could give you, or we could give you this graph and say, what does the price ceiling here impact the equilibrium price in the market? And you would just say no, because this $1,000, because it is above the equilibrium price, there's no impact to the equilibrium of $800. So that would be an example of a question you could be asked.
Professor, is
Yeah,
there
yeah.
ever a case in which the equilibrium price and the price ceiling are the exact same? Like if they cap it at 800?
That's a good question. So there can be, but when that happens, basically the price ceiling doesn't change the equilibrium outcome. So there's not really an impact.
So it would still be called like not binding.
Yeah, because it's
Okay.
basically not changing the outcome. Yeah. Kind of just an example, because that actually does happen sometimes. So when governments actually put in rent control, usually the initial rent control is actually the same as the equilibrium price in the market. But over time, what happens is the effectively the rent increases, and so it actually becomes binding. So that's an example of kind of how it can initially be not binding, but then become binding.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Do anyone else have any other questions on price ceilings before I move on to price floors? Okay. So just to kind of, I know we already talked about this, but just to kind of briefly touch on it again. So price ceilings cause shortages, and shortages are basically just the difference where there is a greater quantity demanded on one side and a smaller quantity supplied on the other side. So there's this kind of difference between the two quantities demanded and supplied. So what happens when there's a shortage is basically sellers are going to ration the goods among buyers. And there are kind of two common methods that are used. So the first is like long lines. So like if you've ever had to wait in line for like a new video game release or like a new sneaker release, that is an example of kind of a rationing mechanism where basically you just have to get in line and wait in line until it's your turn. And sometimes they can run out of the good before you have a chance to buy it. And that's just, you know, kind of what happens with that rationing mechanism. The other mechanism, and this one is much more insidious, is discrimination according to the seller's biases. And so this is actually something that is more common among like apartment rentals and stuff. So basically, like if a seller says that I don't want to rent an apartment to anyone that has short hair, that could be something that they could do. And it's really hard to prove that, specifically like in the apartment rental area. And a lot of times with like the number 2 discrimination to the seller's biases, a lot of times those are racist. So that's one of kind of the reasons why price ceilings, when they cause shortages, they can impact either people of color or lower income people much more adversely than higher income people, because higher income people can actually cheat. And basically they can just say, hey, we'll give you, you know, $1,000 extra if you can give this to us. So that's kind of one of the ways that price ceilings and shortages can negatively impact lower income individuals. So kind of just an important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about price ceilings. I'm going to skip this example. Okay, so the next thing is price floors. And this example is kind of weird because when you think about like the wage market, it's actually supply and demand are reversed. So the supply here is actually workers. So like when I am in the job market, I am a supply effectively. So I'm represented on the supply side because I am looking for a job. Whereas the demand side is companies. So basically when companies are looking for workers, they are demanding workers. So just kind of a little bit flipped from how we normally think of demand and supply. And so the W in this case is going to represent the wages paid to workers, and L is representing the quantity of workers in the market. So let's in this case think that we have a equilibrium price in this market of $14 an hour. And at the equilibrium wage of $14 an hour, the quantity of labor supplied is going to be 500. So what's going to happen when there's a price floor? So first, we're going to talk about non-binding price floors. So non-binding price floors are just below the equilibrium price. So if the government set a price floor at $13, that would be not binding. It's not having any impact on the equilibrium price. The equilibrium wage here is still $14, and the equilibrium quantity is still 500 workers. So that does not impact the equilibrium price or quantity at all. But if we have a binding price floor, that is going to be above the wage. So effectively what's happening here is that the new wage is going to be $15, where the old wage was $14. So what that does is that creates a difference between the quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And in this case, that's effectively just a labor surplus, which is also called unemployment. So this would be an example of what kind of unemployment can look like. Basically, there's a larger supply of workers and a smaller demand from companies for workers at that specific price. So I did kind of want to briefly mention minimum wage because it's a pretty contentious topic, and it's really important that the textbook that we use for this class has a very, very particular opinion about the minimum wage, which is not actually backed up by a lot of the literature. And so in the real world, we don't actually know if minimum wage causes unemployment. There have been a bunch of studies that have looked at that, and these studies have found either it does cause a little bit, or it doesn't cause any, or it actually increases employment. So while kind of increasing the minimum wage can increase unemployment, it also boosts wages. And because it boosts wages, that effectively means that people are spending more money in the economy. And so because of that, that can actually create more jobs, which can also then elevate minimum wage workers out of poverty. So just kind of an important piece that I think it's important to kind of think about, because when we think about minimum wage, a lot of times people think about this specific example right here and say, oh, well, this, must be true all the time. And a lot of times what we teach in like introductory microeconomics is not actually true in the real world, just because we simplify it so much. And this is a really important example of how one of those kind of things that we teach is not actually really true in the real world. So just kind of an important piece to keep in mind. Okay. Actually, before I move on to taxes, does anyone have any questions on price floors or price ceilings?
Yeah, I got a question. So, are you saying that binding price floors causes unemployment?
So the model says yes. In the real world, that's actually not true. And we don't actually know what really happens. But the basic model here, says that a binding price floor does cause unemployment.
Gotcha.
Professor, so like on like the midterm, if it asks us if it creates unemployment, do you want us to answer based on what the textbook says, or like the real world application?
Yeah, so like for this example, they definitely will not ask like that specific of a question. What they would probably ask is something like, does a binding price floor create a labor surplus? And in that case, you would say yes, because you know that binding price floors create surpluses.
Okay, got it.
Did anyone else have any other questions before I moved on to taxes?
Wait, so the labor surplus is just another way to say they're unemployed, like there is unemployment, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and the reason why, just to kind of, because that's a good point, this like particular model we're using for wages is very different than how we normally think about demand and supply. So just kind of important to remember when you're talking about wages and quantity of labor, that supply and demand are reversed in this specific model. Okay, so let me move on then to taxes. So the government can basically tax any good or service. The two most common ones are sales tax, so taxes on like physical goods that we buy, or property tax, which is basically just a tax on like, apartment, a house, a physical piece of property. The important piece here is like the government can make buyers or sellers pay the tax, but who pays what portion or amount of the tax is the tax instance. And we phrase that differently for a very important reason, because we then are talking about, from tax instance, how the burden of tax is shared among market participants. And so we're going to go into this a little bit further in the later slides, but just to kind of briefly like touch on it, So the burden of taxation will frequently be slightly higher on buyers or slightly higher on sellers, depending on the elasticity of the demand or supply curve. So that's kind of how we think about taxation, because ultimately the total amount of the tax doesn't change. Like if the government levies a $4 tax, it levies a $4 tax. But the split of how that tax is paid between buyers and sellers, that can differentiate, or that can vary depending on the elasticity of the demand and supply curve. So in this first example, we're going to look at a tax on buyers. So let's say that the tax on buyers here is $1.50. So this chunk right there represents the tax. So the price that buyers pay is $11. So before, buyers paid $10 for the good. Before the tax, buyers paid $10. After the tax, buyers are paying $11 for the good. And before the tax, sellers received $10, whereas after the tax, sellers are receiving $9.50. So note here that the difference between the impact on buyers and sellers is different. So there is a dollar difference here, but only a 50-cent difference here. So that is how the burden is shared unequally between the two. So buyers are having a larger portion of the tax burden than sellers in this particular case. So as I kind of already said, this tax is on buyers. The burden of the tax is still shared. So like buyers and sellers are in total paying $1.50, but it is shared unequally between buyers and sellers. And we note here that dollar difference for buyers and the 50-cent difference for sellers. So their instance is different, which is an important piece to kind of think about, because the total tax amount in the market doesn't change, but the instance of the tax can change depending upon who it's levied on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So is it always unequally shared, or can it be, there's like times when it is like equally shared?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So yes, there can definitely be times where it's equally shared. I think in a lot of the examples that we do for this class, we try to make it unequally shared, but there definitely can be times where it is equally shared. It's more common for it to be unequally shared though, just because the elasticity for supply and demand would have to be the same if it was going to be equal.
Okay, I have one more question.
Yeah.
So, when I was watching the videos, there was a statement and it said, a $1 unit tax levied on consumers of a good is equivalent to a $1 per unit tax levied on the producers of the good. So it's kind of confusing because like it's saying that it's the same and then there's like equal and unequal. So it's like, can you kind of like explain that statement a little further?
Yeah. No, that's that's a really good question. So what that question was trying to get at in we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later too, but basically whoever the tax is on, so if it's a $1.50 tax on buyers, that tax is equivalent to a $1.50 tax on sellers, because remember, the tax is going to be on the entire market. The only thing we're kind of differentiating here is who is going to share that burden. So like here, it's split unequally between buyers and sellers, but the total amount is still $1.50. And in this case, if we said that we were going to tax sellers rather than buyers, this would look exactly the same as long as the supply and demand curve didn't change, because basically it doesn't matter who the tax is on. All that matters is the total amount of the tax, and then the split of the tax right here.
So it's kind of about like who pays like more of what, basically.
Yeah, for this piece it is. In that question, what they were trying to get you to think about though was that if the tax is on buyers or sellers, that doesn't matter, because the thing that matters about the taxation instance, or like who is paying more of the tax, is all about the elasticity of the supply and demand curve.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions before I moved on to taxes on sellers?
I just have a quick one more question, sorry.
Yeah,
Can
no
you
worries.
can you just go over how you got the answers that you have here, like buyers pay in market of 11, and it says like 11 minus 10 and stuff like that?
Yeah, okay, yeah, for sure. So in this case, what we're seeing here is we're basically starting off at an equilibrium price of $10. So kind of before tax, $10. So then what happens is you're going to have to basically shift the demand curve down so that the difference between the intersection point, actually, let me mark that so it's a little clearer. So the difference between the new intersection point of the new demand curve and the old supply curve, when you go up and hit the old demand curve, that difference, this green line, has to be $1.50. Basically, it has to be the amount of the tax. So that's how we determine how far to shift the demand curve down, is by looking at the new point here and comparing it to just straight up where it intersects with the demand curve. And so in this specific case, the price that buyers pay is always going to be the point on the old demand curve, whereas the new equilibrium point is going to be the price the sellers receive for the good.
Wait, so I just want to reconfirm. So it is unequally shared between buyers and sellers. And I think you said before that it could be equally shared.
Yes, yeah, that's correct. It could be equally shared. It's not super common, but it definitely can happen.
Professor, and on this case, we're assuming that demand is always going to shift down because it's an increased price, right? So people wouldn't want to pay more for the item.
Yes, yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily say more, because buyers are actually paying more, like they're paying $1 more than they were previously paying. But the thing that's different here is that they're not paying a full $1.50, full $1.50 more than they were paying previously.
Okay. Got it.
Does that kind of make sense? I know it's weird to think about, because when you think of like a tax on buyers, it like with that phrasing, you assume that buyers are going to be paying all of the tax. But basically what you have to do is say, so the demand curve is going to shift down, and then this point, you have to determine where the new equilibrium point is, which is in this case here, and then just draw a line up to make sure that the difference between the new equilibrium point and the old demand curve is the amount of the tax.
Wait, right now, okay, right now when you talk about the demand curve, it makes me kind of confused right now. So the demand symbolizes the tax. So since the tax on buyer, but how do you indicate whether it's buyers or sellers? So the sellers, if the tax is on the sellers, then do you move up?
Yes, so the next slide, we will talk about what
Okay,
a tax
sorry.
on, oh, no worries. That's a really good question though. But yeah, so in the next slide, we'll talk about kind of what happens with sellers. But as far as a tax on buyers, does anyone have any other questions on this slide before we move on to the sellers piece? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at a tax on sellers. So remember, in both cases, the tax amount is exactly the same. So it's $1.50 and $1.50 here. But now the effective tax instance for both buyers and sellers is actually the same. So you'll notice when the tax was on buyers, it was $1 and sellers paid 50 cents. When it's on sellers though, and as long as the demand and supply curve, the original demand and supply curve are the same as in the prior example, the burden or the tax instance sharing between buyers and sellers is going to be exactly the same regardless of who the tax is on. The only thing that's shifting here or changing is supply is decreasing rather than demand. But that doesn't matter because the original supply and demand curve are the same. And so because of that, the tax instance of buyers and the tax instance of sellers is going to be exactly the same. Let me pause here to see if there are any questions, because it's a very important point that whoever the tax is on, as long as the supply and demand curve are the same, the instance is going to be exactly the same between buyers and sellers.
Professor, so most of the time, like you could pretty much say that you will never see a tax incidence where it'll be greater for the seller. I mean, for the seller, right, rather than the buyer.
No, so you actually can see that. The example I'm using is true because demand is more inelastic than supply, but it's definitely not uncommon to see sellers pay more of a tax instance than buyers. But yeah, that's a very good question, because yeah, that's definitely an important point.
Can you just go back to the graph and maybe explain a little about the comparison between the graphs? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so in this one, the only difference here, or actually, let me first back up and let's look at the original graph, and then we can compare it to the new one. So note here that the demand curve is shifting down because of the tax. In the difference here for the tax is the $1.50. Buyers are paying $11 for the good. Sellers are receiving $9.50. In this case, though, the tax is on sellers. So the supply curve is shifting, and the supply curve is going to decrease and move to the right. So because of that, though, there's actually no change on the price that buyers are paying for the good in the price that sellers are receiving for the good. Because note here that buyers are still paying $11 for the good, and sellers are still receiving $9.50 for the good. So nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is that the supply curve shifts rather than the demand curve. So that's the only difference. If the taxes on sellers supply curve shifts, tax on buyers demand curve shifts.
I also noticed how the way you explained it before, you talk about how like the buyers pays $1 and then the sellers earns 50 cents.
Or pay 50 cents.
Okay, got it. So it's the same explanation, just that we switched to a different line. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. In the instance, let me zoom out here so you can see. So the instance that buyers and sellers are paying does not change because the demand and supply curve are the same. So this supply curve in this supply and demand curve have exactly the same elasticity. So that's why there is not a change in how the instance of tax is shared between buyers and sellers. Did anyone else have any other questions on that? Because this is a really, I think it's kind of like a confusing thing to think about, that it doesn't matter who the tax is on, but very, very important to think about.
So all we need to know is that for the buyers, the demand curve shifts and sellers supply curve. That's all we need to know, right?
Yeah, that's basically the takeaway. Yeah. Okay. So then just kind of to summarize everything, kind of the important piece. So in both cases, we saw that the tax could be on buyers or sellers. In the effects of that tax on the price and quantity are the same, regardless of whether the tax is imposed on buyers and sellers. So that basically just reiterates what we talked about, that if the tax is on buyers or sellers, it's still having the same impact as long as the supply curve and demand curve are the same. And the reason why this matters is because what the tax is doing is it's driving a wedge between the price that buyers are paying in the market and the price that sellers are receiving for their good in the market. So that's really all a tax is doing. Just think of it as like there's a wedge between the consumer price and the producer price. And that's all that we're really saying. I'm going to skip this example, but I do have like an explanation of it in the slide. So definitely if you kind of wanted to walk through an example, feel free to take a look at this because I think it's kind of a decent way to think about it. Okay, so I did mention too that elasticity is important. And so elasticity is actually really important for determining who shares the tax instance. So in this particular example, we see here that supply is more elastic than demand. So demand is almost perfectly inelastic, where it's a straight vertical line. And supply is much more elastic. So what that means is that buyers are going to bear a larger share of the burden of taxation, or have a larger tax instance than sellers. And we can see that here because buyers have this chunk, whereas sellers just have this tiny chunk. And that is because demand is very, very inelastic, whereas supply is much more elastic. So that's kind of the elasticity implications. And let's talk about kind of the reverse situation. So in this case, we basically flipped supply and demand. So now demand is more elastic than supply. And so because of that, sellers are now bearing a larger burden or having a larger instance of taxation than buyers are, because supply is closer to being inelastic than demand is. Okay, and let me pause here and see if there are any questions, because kind of a weird way to think about elasticity impacting tax instance.
I'm trying to think of the exact question, but I think it had something to do with farmers and the web assigned. So I think the question said something like farmers were renting the land, but the government imposed a tax on the land. And then it said, who would it impact the most? And I believe it was on the landowner and not the farmer. But I didn't really understand why.
Yeah, so basically, without like seeing the exact question, what they were trying to get at there was basically to see which are the buyers in the market. Do they have a more elastic demand curve, or do the sellers? And so whichever one has the more elastic demand curve or more elastic curve, they are going to bear a larger portion of the burden.
So in this case, I guess it was the landowner that.
Yeah, that would, yeah, just not knowing the specific question, but kind of like if that was the answer, then yeah, it would need to be them.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And so here's just kind of like, because I know some people don't are not visual learners, so just kind of a summary of like what that elasticity and tax instance look like. And so effectively, just if a buyer's price elasticity is greater than a seller's price elasticity, basically saying that buyers demand curve is more elastic than the supply curve, buyers can more easily leave the market when the tax is imposed. So buyers will bear a smaller share of the burden than sellers, because basically buyers can say, well, you know, this good is much more expensive now, so I'm going to walk away from consuming this good because I don't need to consume this good. Whereas sellers, if they have a higher, if they're effectively a lower price elasticity, they're kind of more locked into that market, and it's harder for them to leave the market.
So can we just look at it this from like demand, and that like if demand's elastic, buyers have other options, so they could just, so that's why they won't pay as much.
Yeah, exactly. And the or the inverse would be true as well if sellers were more elastic as well.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. That's a good way to look at it, though. Okay, and then so usually taxation is caused by caused because the government wants to somehow change or improve social welfare. And one of the ways that that can be worked through is calculating the surplus. And so surplus is, we've already talked about consumer and producer. So now we're going to talk about government tax revenue and then also deadweight loss. So in this kind of like simplified example, without the tax, we can see here that the consumer surplus is the upper triangle, so the ABC, and producer surplus is the lower triangle, or DEF. So normal without the tax. Now with the tax, this happens. So we can see here that the consumer surplus, when there's a tax, is reduced to just A. The producer surplus is reduced to just F. Tax revenue is going to be this rectangle, which is B and D. And then finally, deadweight loss is going to be this triangle here, which is C and E. And basically all deadweight loss is trying to say is that there is a decrease in the quantity. So basically the old quantity consumed at the pre-tax equilibrium is QE. When a tax is implemented, that decreases to QT. So because of that, this decrease is effectively deadweight loss. And this triangle represents the deadweight loss. And so to calculate deadweight loss, all we do is use the 1/2 base times height formula. So exactly the same as we've previously done. The only difference is that in this case, we need to remember that there is a quantity change. So rather than just taking the equilibrium quantity, we have to take that difference between 70 and 50 and then multiply that by the amount of the tax, and then multiply that by 1/2. And so I have an example up here where I solve for the deadweight loss in this example. So I'm just taking the original equilibrium quantity, subtracting the quantity after tax, then taking the price that buyers are paying minus the price that sellers are receiving. And then that is going to give me the deadweight loss in this market. Okay, does anyone have any questions before we do a top hat question?
Quick question. So originally, before the tax, A, B, C will be considered as consumer surplus altogether, right? And then like D, E, F will be the producers. So that even after the tax, the two amounts should be equal to each other, right?
Yes, yeah, that is exactly correct. Okay, so let me stop sharing and let's take a look at the top hat question. Okay, so this example, and let me drag it out, is basically asking, so what is consumer and producer surplus before the tax is implemented? And so the formula we need to think about is the 1/2 base times height formula to calculate this. And let me know if anyone has any questions on solving this as well. And I'll give maybe like 2 or 3 minutes to solve this, and then I'll walk through the answer. Okay, and 1 more minute. If you haven't had a chance to answer, that's totally fine. You can just pick a letter, because these are not graded by correctness, just as long as you participate. Okay, another 30 seconds. So if you haven't answered yet, make sure to answer before I close the question. Okay, another 10 seconds and then I'll close the question. Okay. So let's see. Okay, excellent. So about half got it right. Okay, so let's take a look then at what the solution is. So remember for the formula, we always need to do the 1/2 base times height. So that's kind of always going to be our kind of base. So what we're going to do then is we see for consumer surplus, so CS is going to be equal to 1/2. And then in this case, we're going to have the 10. And the 10 comes from the quantity right here. So that is the equilibrium quantity. Then we're going to multiply that by the price difference. So we're going to take the 20, which is where the demand curve intersects with the price, and multiply that by the equilibrium price, which is 10. And when we solve that, that gives us 50. So for producer surplus, it's going to be the same formula. So it's going to be producer surplus is equal to 1/2. And that is going to then also still be 10, because remember, this is before tax. Then we're going to multiply that by the 10, which we get from the equilibrium. And then we're going to subtract that from 4. And let me just, because this should also be
Professor, once you subtract that, yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions on how we got that? Because I can guarantee you there will be at least one question that is similar to this on the midterm, if not more.
Wait, Professor, so where did 1/2 come from again?
Yeah, so the 1/2 is just from the area of a triangle formula, which is the 1/2 base times height. And that's the formula we're basically going to be using for calculating producer surplus, consumer surplus, and deadweight loss.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Professor, nothing happens if we get this question wrong, right?
Say that one more time.
Nothing happens if we get this question wrong, right? Like on test.
No. Yeah, it's just for kind of doing like a check-in to see if everyone's kind of understanding the topics. Yeah,
Okay,
so it's just participation. Did anyone else have any other questions before we move on to the next one? Okay. So then let's move to question 3. Okay, so this question is asking you, assume the graph is drawn to scale. Which of the following is true regarding the burden of the tax in the market? So remember, here we're thinking about the burden of taxation and how that burden is shared between buyers and sellers. and kind of a good hint on this question or other questions like it is think about the surplus amounts when you're thinking about this question, and what is happening to consumer and producer surplus after the tax is implemented. Okay, and I'll give another minute to let you all answer, and then we'll go over the answer. Okay, another 30 seconds, and then I will lock the question.
Professor, my computer is not letting me answer the question.
If you can send me an email, I will give you credit for this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to close the question. Okay, and awesome. Okay, cool. So yeah, so that's exactly correct. So because in this instance, sellers are going to pay a larger share of the tax because supply is more inelastic than demand. In a good way to think about that, and like this is not going to be true all the time because they will occasionally or not. I'm pretty sure we're not going to do that. We did that once on one midterm, but I'm pretty sure we're not going to do that where we drew the graph to not match. But what you can assume is that, so like supply is kind of closer to being perfectly inelastic. So just if you rotate supply a little bit, it's closer to being perfectly vertical, whereas demand is pretty horizontal already. So if you just nudge it down a little bit, it's going to be perfectly elastic. So because of that, you know that supply is more inelastic than demand. And so because supply is more inelastic than demand, you know that sellers are going to pay a larger share of the tax burden. Also, if you just didn't want to deal with that at all, because you're like, that's too complicated, I don't want to deal with like thinking about that, you can just look at the graph and see, so that chunk here, and let me draw that. So the chunk right here, this is all of the producer or seller burden of the tax versus this smaller chunk right here is consumer tax burden. So if you didn't even want to deal with that, you could just say clearly in this case, consumers are paying less. And so that would help you at least narrow it down to just 2 of the answers rather than having to look through all 4. Does anyone have any questions on that before we move on?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Kind of just like a clarification for my notes. Because what I have written is when supply is more elastic than demand, buyers bear more of the burden of taxation because demand is more inelastic.
Those 2 should be reversed.
Okay, like what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so basically, say that one more time and I will rephrase it.
So I have 2 sentences here. So the first one, when supply is more elastic than demand, buyers bear more of the burden because demand is more inelastic.
So switch elastic and inelastic, and then it's correct.
So when supply is more inelastic, buyers bear more of the burden because demand is more elastic.
Actually, sorry, say that one more time. I think I'm not sure fully. Okay, so when, so basically when supply is more inelastic, buyers bear more of the tax burden. Is that kind of what the question is trying to get at, or what the statement is trying to get at? Sorry.
Yeah, I have for the first statement is when supply is more inelastic than demand, buyers bear more of the burden because demand is more elastic. Like than demand.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So basically, when you're thinking about that, if demand is more elastic, that's going to mean that buyers bear less of the burden than suppliers.
So sellers bear more.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the one difference there. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry, it took me a while to work through that.
that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions before we move on? Yeah, and so we didn't do question 2. I usually do like extra questions just in case we have extra time. But since we did not have a full amount of time, that's totally okay that we did not answer question 2. Okay, so now let's take a look at the questions that you all had asked me on Top Hat. Okay, and so hopefully everyone can read that first one. If not, I'll read it too. So Sophie pays Sky $50 to mow her lawn every week. When the government levies a mowing tax of $10 on Sky, he raises his price to $60. Sophie continues to hire him at the higher price. What is the change in producer surplus, consumer surplus, and deadweight loss? So the first thing with this question is this is a super simple example. This is definitely not kind of as complicated as the stuff we were doing in the slides. So because of that, there's only one producer and one seller in the market, or one buyer in the market. So because of that, Sky is fully able to pass the costs of the tax on to Sophie. So effectively, Sky's the money that he's making doesn't decrease. His producer surplus stays the same. Consumer surplus, though, on the other hand, decreases because Sophie is now effectively paying $10 more for the service. And there's no deadweight loss because there's only one producer and one consumer. So basically, there's nothing, there's no decrease in quantity in this example. So very simple example, but kind of good to think about.
Wait, quick question.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
why isn't the lawnmower having a producer surplus of $10 if he's making more?
Because that $10 is going to the government right away through the tax.
He won't get to keep like any of it.
No.
Got it.
Yeah, because it's basically the entire, so his price used to be 50 and now it's 60. So basically he just increased his price by the amount of the tax.
Wait, can you explain quickly why is there no deadweight loss?
Yeah, so this is a very, very simple example, and there's no deadweight loss because there's only one producer. So Sky is the only producer, and Sophie is the only consumer. So there's basically just a one-to-one here. And because of that, there's no deadweight loss because there is no decrease in the equilibrium quantity in the market. So there is still, Sky is still selling one mowing service to Sophie, and Sophie is still buying that one mowing service. So in that market, there's no change in the equilibrium, which is what causes deadweight loss.
Will this be like a rule, like there's only 1-to-1 ratio relationship and there will never be like, because there's no like surplus where like.
Yeah, I think you could probably safely think of it like that. Basically, when there is when there is no decrease in the quantity after a tax is implemented, there is no deadweight loss. So basically, if the quantity in the market doesn't decrease, there's no change in deadweight loss. Okay, I'm going to skip that one and then go to this example, which I believe is from the news analysis for chapter 8. And I do realize that I'm hitting time. So if you have to leave, totally fine. If you want to stick around, that's also totally fine. I'll post this on Blackboard. So if you have something afterwards, do not feel obligated, but I will make sure to finish the couple questions that I got. Okay, so in this example, we're looking at here, the government is considering levying a tax of $80 per unit on suppliers of either leather jackets or smartphones. So the supply curve for both of the goods is identical. The demand curve, though, is slightly different. So in this first example right here, what we had to do was we had to show the tax revenue of the government, which is effectively just, I'll zoom in, the difference between the price buyers are paying and the price sellers are receiving, and just goes all the way to the price. So basically that chunk right there is tax revenue. Deadweight loss, on the other hand, is going to be the old equilibrium, so to the old equilibrium, and then this triangle right here. So we can think about the tax amount as being the difference between the price consumers are paying or the price buyers are paying versus the producer or the price that sellers are receiving. And that difference is going to be the $80 tax. Okay, so this is the leather jacket market. So now let's take a look at the cell phone market or smartphone market. Okay, so in this instance, same tax, we have the difference here being the price that buyers are paying for the good and the price sellers are receiving. This is going to be the tax revenue, and this small little triangle is deadweight loss. So then define tax, consumer, what consumers are paying, what producers are paying, and tax difference. Okay, so now we need to find the tax revenue and deadweight loss for each example. So tax revenue is super, super simple. All we're going to do is take the quantity in the market, multiply it by the price, and that's the tax revenue. So, or sorry, the tax. So this is going to be quantity, this is going to be tax. And I'll put a, to clarify that. So quantity, tax price. That's all we do for tax revenue. For deadweight loss, we have to do the 1/2 base times height. So for that, what we do is we're going to take the old quantity minus the new quantity after tax. and then multiply that by the tax price, and that gives us the deadweight loss. And we simply do that for both, and we can see that the government would be smarter and minimize deadweight loss if they taxed smartphones, because they get more tax revenue and there's less deadweight loss. And so because of that, all we need to remember is just that taxing good with relatively less elastic demand generates a larger tax revenue and smaller deadweight loss. And we can even see that when we look here, just because the demand curve for smartphones is almost inelastic, whereas the demand for leather jackets is much closer to being perfectly elastic. So just kind of those two differentiators are good. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to the next question? Okay. So then the next question was about, and this was actually a very, very complicated one, was the news analysis on the rental market in LA and Orange County. So this one is actually looking at basically asking you, what is the rent increase? And so with this question, the first thing you need to do is just say, what is the increase in rent? So you first have to take the, let me get my original rent price here, which is 1,500, multiply it by 1.20 to get the 20% rent increase, which then gives you 1,800. So that's telling you that the effective just of the rent increase is going to be increasing rent from the previous equilibrium of 1,500 to a new point of 1,800. And then you also have to do that for the 10% increase that was caused by the earnings increase. So basically incomes increased as well. But the main point of this question is that it's trying to show you what is the impact of rental controls. And so basically what it's asking you to do is say that California imposes a rental control of $1,800 across the state. So this is going to be the new effective cap on rents. So because of that, that's going to cause a difference between demand and supply. And that difference between demand and supply is effectively a shortage. And that shortage is 100 units. So that 100 unit difference right here, we can see there's going to be a 100 unit shortage in the market. Okay, let me pause here and see if there are any questions before moving to the next one.
So on this example, how did you get 400 units?
Yes, that is a good question. So the 400 units are effectively just taking a look at the difference between the units demanded originally in the new demand, if that makes sense. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's a really weird way to think about it, I think.
So the new units would be 700 or 7? Is that 700?
Yeah, so let me make sure I'm phrasing this right, because I want to make sure so basically what's happening here is this part of the question is actually asking you to think about this point here.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that's basically saying is that if demand did not shift, what would be the number of vacant units at a price of 1,800?
Okay.
In the kind of other piece to that as well is that imagine the demand curve. So the consumer demand for apartments does not change, and that supply also does not change. That supply is basically fixed and totally irrelevant for this particular question. That's something that we won't really talk about ever, because this is a particularly difficult question, but just kind of something to think about.
Got it. I understand. I wasn't understanding how, because I was trying to do it from the bottom, from the quantity, so it wasn't making any sense, because 700 minus 400 and 600, nothing made sense, but I get it now. So
Okay.
It was all based on 20% of the original price, and then from that, just 400.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
thank
and
you.
this is worded really poorly too, so that definitely doesn't help.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Do anyone else have any other questions on this one before I move on to the next one? Okay. So just really quickly, a couple people asked, like, what's the difference between macro and micro economics? Macro is just like the entire economy and the entire world economy, whereas micro, we're looking at like individual consumers and producers, and then also individual markets. So that's just kind of the difference between macro and microeconomics. And micro is also usually much more math based than macro. Okay. And so the final question I had was about, I believe, the Chapter 8 news analysis question for Airbnb rentals. So the original problem gives you the equilibrium quantity of rentals and the equilibrium price. So we have this graph here. In this graph, what we have to do is basically find the amount of the tax, which is given to us here, where it says it's levied at a $40 per room tax. So all we need to do with this tax revenue is effectively position it so the point here on the demand curve and the point here on the supply curve, the difference between these two prices is $40, which in this case is going to be $170 for consumers and $130 for producers. Then the question asks us to move forward 8 years from 2010 to 2018. So notice that the supply and demand curve has shifted here. So, oh. Yeah, did someone have a question? Sorry.
I'm sorry, real quick. I asked a question about micro and macro. Can you just, if you can scroll back up real quick, is it on the same page?
Yeah.
Yeah, just so I could just. You're good. I just want to, because I'm the one who asked that question. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like macro is just basically like kind of the whole economy, like when we're looking at, trade between countries. We talk about that a little bit in this class, but that's really not the focus. Whereas micro is like really, really specific to like individual markets and individual consumers and producers, rather than like, what's happening with the entire US economy in like inflation. Macro and micro, or macro deals a lot more with inflation, and micro doesn't really touch on inflation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so then for the 2018 version, what we can see is basically the same thing is happening. There's a $40 tax, but now there is this difference here between the buyer and seller. So note that the prices are different. So buyers are paying effectively $160, whereas sellers are receiving $120. So that's still the $40 tax difference, but just kind of arrived at in a different way. Okay. And then in the same kind of vein as we did in the prior example, for the tax revenue, we have the tax price times the quantity So we have the 40 and 40, and then the quantity for the prior example was the 400, and then the 480 for that example. So that's going to give us the tax revenue, and then the deadweight loss is just going to be, let me see if I can scroll down, is just going to be that difference in consumption. So it's just going to be the difference between the old equilibrium, the new equilibrium, multiplied by 40. And then that's going to give us the deadweight loss in that example. And then finally, when we're asked this question here, it's just kind of basically reiterating what we already know, is that basically government should tax more inelastic things because that minimizes deadweight loss. Does anyone have any questions on that one? Because I know I got a decent amount of top hat questions on that.